What's your take on smart cities in general, the global take on smart cities as an initiative, and how far have we pressed down that route?
Smart cities development is an absolutely critical part of our path forward. And the other great cliched term now that is in fact important, of course, is digital twins. And both of those things tie to the same question, being able to gather data about the operation of our city and understand it in a way that allows us to more effectively operate those cities. And that, of course, is an extremely important goal.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited. I can't kick off this without asking you a burning question I've been thinking of all over the weekend over here. What's your favorite chocolate? What's your favorite ice cream flavor, actually? Mine is chocolate.
Okay. Well, I could answer either one of those. My favorite is definitely Ben and Jerry's.
Jerry's.
Probably the Today Show or Today Dough, whatever it's called. But historically, it's definitely been the chocolate chip cookie dough, the cookie dough ice cream.
Can never go wrong with that one. No.
Yes. I that's right. And I've grew during my early teen years. I was living in the U.S. I was actually born in New York, even though I've lived most of my life in Australia. And I used to spend my summers up on Lake Champlain, up in upstate New York. And directly across the lake from Burlington, which is where Ben and Jerry's is. And as an early teenager, I used to get my ice cream from Jerry. Because
the real Jerry
made the real Jerry.
Oh,
Ben
gosh.
made the ice cream, and Jerry had the little mobile cart on wheels that he rolled down to the ferry at the lakefront.
Oh my God.
And that was Ben and Jerry's, two guys with a cart.
Wow. I've never looked into that. I've never knew about it. I mean, the history here. That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Now, enough with ice cream. Let's talk about technology over here. You have an astounding and impressive profile over here. Looking at what you achieved so far on professional level. I mean, I believe you are an architect by education.
Yes.
And then, you've worked in events. You were a founder of a major events management pretty much organization. I don't know if it's still going till now or that was something in the past. You've been a long advocate of BIM, probably one of the earliest users of Revit, starting with ArchiCAD or ArchiCAD back in 1996. I also believe, you've been to many places. You've worked on you had exposure to an incredible number of projects, big, small, you name it, different places and regions of the world. You've been heavily invested in Southeast Asia lately, but there's nothing seems to stop your ambition from growing even further or knowing even more and getting into different industries around the globe. So why don't you just tell us about DBI? What was the reason of starting it and how did it get to where it is right now?
Yeah. So if we go all the way backwards to really the start of the journey into what became DBI, it was around about 2003. As you mentioned, I was quite an early adopter in BIM tools generally, and had been using what was at the time MiniCAD became Vectorworks, and then ArchiCAD as well in the mid-90s. And had started my own architectural practice in 97. And in 99, because I had a drop in work, I picked up Revit and started working with that. So I was, in fact, the first Revit user in Australia, just through lucky timing, back just before version 1. In fact, I found my original Revit CD-ROM recently, which had handwritten on it Perspectives version 0.8, which is before they called it Revit. But in 2003, I set up a Revit user group in Sydney, Australia. Mm-hmm. And this was back at a time before we had YouTube and people doing help videos. There was no books that hadn't been written yet. There really was no resources available to users that you could lean on to help you when you had problems. So the user group, while very small, really was your only true resource for getting help. And so after a couple of years of that, the group, in a very Australian way, decided that getting together once a month for a wine about the product, that it would be fun to do something a bit more than that. And hopefully I get away with this on your podcast. But the quote was, "We need to get together for the weekend, geek out and get shit-faced." In other words, a good way to connect is to have a few drinks. And I said, well, I'll put something together. So this was in 2005, which is when we did our first event up in the mountains just outside of Sydney. And indeed, the very first evening was concluded when we had closed down the bar, emptied all the bar fridges into a collective table in the lobby of the hotel, and suddenly realized that was the sun coming up outside, and everybody scurried off like a bunch of cockroaches to have showers before the start of day two. So a very successful thing, and it grew from there. But
Is this where you had your idea that, probably we should have this organization or governing body where we kind of get this going just beyond just the one time here and there?
Well, funnily enough, no. And that was basically what I was about to say, because at that point, there really was not a grand organizing principle or goal beyond just be fun to get together and spend more time. Now, obviously, that was very successful. Oh, we should do it again. And we did. The very first event was referred to as the Revit National Congress. And we decided quite quickly that national was limiting, that Congress, at least in Australia, might be regarded as a bad word, and needed to change it. And it became the Revit Technology Conference. Even that, over the years, as we developed DBI, we decided is limiting and not truly directly indicative of our mission. But it was only probably 2012 where really started to recognize what we had begun to build in terms of a broad international community, and what would be the potential leverage we could gain from that to affect positive change. Our first international event was in 2011 in the United States. It was in Huntington Beach in California. And we have always, as we've moved into new areas to hold events, to connect with community, treated that as a pull process. In other words, we have looked for local communities to reach a certain level of maturity, a certain level of need, where they've reached out to us and said, can you bring your events to our region? Are there resources and support methodologies that you can help us with to take that next step as a local community? I think a really big genesis of the broader change for us was an event we held in Budapest in Hungary in 2014, I think, where the team had asked me to put together a series of little snippets of history of the event series and tips that we were going to turn into stickers to go on the windows of a glass bridge between the hotel section and the conference section. And in doing that process, it was the first time for a long time I'd really assessed in a holistic manner what we had done and what we had achieved. And I had this feeling in my head that as a community, as an organization, we really hadn't changed much. We hadn't really grown or done much. But it was when I looked at this that I suddenly realized, well, our first international event was in 2011. And now we've got events in Australia, New Zealand, in Europe, in Asia, in North America. We've got several thousand people coming. We're touching on this, we're doing that. And suddenly realized the vector that the organization was taking, and that caused us to reassess. I'm someone who has always needed a big purpose in the things that I hunt for, that I try and achieve. It led me to recognize that the sorts of research and thoughts that I've been putting into our industry could start to be, if not answered, at least responded to. As an industry, we punch above our weight in all the wrong ways. We make use of just over, I think, 52% of the world's energy production. We generate just under 1/3 of physical waste and just over 1/3 of airborne pollution. As a employer, the broad construction industry, so design, construction, operation of the built environment, represents about 1 in 11 employment at a tertiary level. So not just direct employment, but people driving trucks, supplying materials, and all those sorts of things. And yet, half of the world's energy, 1/3 of waste. We're also, by a massive margin, the least productive industry in the world and the least innovative.
Mr. Benn, are these numbers, I have to ask you, are these numbers trending in the right direction or the wrong direction?
The wrong direction. In America, National Institute of Science and Technology did a report, a well-known report back in 2004, looking at, or two reports, in fact, at the same time. One was looking at productivity questions, and the other was looking at waste caused by poor communication in the non-commercial sector of our industry. And in other words, what loss and waste is caused by the poor quality of the briefing provided by the architect to the structural engineer as they hand the documents over. At that next stage to various other engineers, to the builders, et cetera. And at the time, just bad communication was calculated to cost the economy $1.9 trillion a year. The other report is even more telling, and that was looking at productivity improvements from 1920 onwards. And there are 22 basic broad industry classifications worldwide. Construction, which, as I mentioned, is all of built environment, education, healthcare, mining, agriculture, etc. Of those 22 industries, construction is the least productive. And the second worst, I think, was agriculture, which improved by like 85% in that period. Our industry had improved by 1.4%. And when yes, and when you looked at the numbers, it actually becomes even worse, because what it showed is that from 1920 through till the mid 60s, the construction industry was improving in productivity basically in parallel with all other industries. And it's really only around that time that you started to see greater differentiation in productivity improvements on a industry specific basis. And for construction, we are less productive now than we were in 1965. We have dropped. And of course, we are the only other ones. All other industries accelerated in their productivity enhancements, and we fell.
And Mr. Benn, now, if you were to give us an example of how does a construction industry be unproductive, like a tangible example.
Okay. One of the analogies I use, and then go into an example from that, is talking typical residential work. If you were to resurrect a Roman legionnaire today, somebody who lived 2,000 years ago, and you put him on your average residential project pretty much anywhere in the world, you'd need maybe half an hour's training for that person to be comfortable, because They recognize the materials, they recognize the tools largely, not the electric ones, of course. They recognize the method of putting things together, bricks and sticks. And that's a ridiculous statement to have to be able to make, but it is true. The fact that we're still using concrete in the way that we did then. I mean, even the general mixture for concrete, you can get concretes now that cure much faster, which with much lower slumps and much higher strengths, that make the process much more efficient, but it's generally not being used. Within our own industry, what all this ties back to is we have the tools and the technologies to be massively more efficient than we are. We have the new processes and skill sets required to apply those tools and technologies. We have the understanding of the problems in our industry that require those changes. And yet when you look at the industry, those changes haven't been happening. And
what are the inhibitors? Why aren't they? Are they economical or political?
They are. All of the above generally tends to be the answer. Economics is one of the very big ones, economies of scale. In our industry, like if you took my background as an architect, so designers, in Australia, the average architectural firm size has grown since I started practicing 30 years ago, 25 years ago. So it's now 2.5 people, the average firm. And a firm over 50 people is regarded as a large firm. In the United States, a firm over 100 people is a large firm. Look at manufacturing. A large organization is 100,000 people. Correct. So we don't have the voice, the scale for certain things. And we don't have the economies of scale in the way we produce things. Aircraft manufacturing, automotive industry, they will design something once and automotive build it several million times. We will design it once, build it once. So it makes it the profit margins are much thinner and harder to track. And the funding, therefore, to go into research is very hard for a lot of people to justify. So there is a big economic question, a big economy of scale question. The investment in technology and training required is a much higher proportion of your costs in our industry. There is then that basic human nature question. People have a tendency, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, we're not still riding horses around and they weren't broken, but we found a better way to do things. And so we are generally resistant to change. I think our industry has been worse than most in that resistance to change. There is a certain machismo in, you can't tell me I'm doing it wrong. And therefore I don't want to change because that's an acknowledgement that I was doing it wrong. So that's part of it as well. There's a few pieces like that.
That was my next question, which is, the industry may sound like it's a one industry, but eventually it's pretty much made up of a lot of sub-industries underneath the same umbrella here. And the question was, how easy does new inventions or even innovations kind of propagate from one industry to the neighboring industry? So if an architect came up with a really innovative way of a construction or construction material that could be used to support his structure or his design, would that be received properly or easily by, let's say, the civil engineering industry or even the construction afterwards? Because eventually that's the organic, natural propagation of the project from one stage to the other. So how synergized are these different neighboring industry and how much they're focused and working together?
Very poorly. There is a quite a distinct dichotomy between the two ends of the industry. And when you look at the sort of community that's engaged through a nonprofit like the Digital Built Environment Institute, these are people for whom that process works very well. and who will take ideas like that and propagate that across different parts of the broad industry quite effectively. And so when you're inside that community, it's easy to look at it and say, oh, no, everything's going great. We are pushing things in the way we need to. We are using technologies the way we need to. We are affecting change. The problem is that as a community, it represents only a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of the industry overall. For instance, we all think about technology and make the assumption that, yes, of course, BIM is the way we should be working at the moment. And in fact, what is the next stage of the evolution of our industry? What is beyond BIM? The hardware and services side of things, like Iron Orbit does in terms of SaaS and cloud products, and getting people off of their bulky local machines. There's an assumption, well, of course this is the way you should do things. But the rest of the industry is still predominantly AutoCAD or hell, drawing boards. Where it isn't in the same space. And a lot of people think, well, I'm too busy doing what I do to look at that sort of stuff. That'll slow me down, even though they don't recognize that it'll slow you down in the short term and accelerate you massively in the future. There is still the older approach and feeling about industry, and it's a very adversarial industry. It's set up in a way to foster blame. If something goes wrong on a site, it's not about getting together and saying, how do we fix this collectively for the better good of the project? It's who do I blame so that I don't get sued? And when you have that, yes, and when you have that kind of mindset, it's very hard to then take risk by adopting new processes and ways of doing things, even though the risk reward analysis would show you that it's very much worth doing. So we have one end of the industry that is clearly acknowledging and pushing the value of making these sorts of changes, adopting these new tools and technologies. But where we are at the moment is trying to figure out, how do we expand that conversation to pick up not just the people at the tip of the spear, the technology adopters, the innovators, but how do we get that all the way through industry, all the way down to the guys carrying shovels on building sites? So, because in the end, everybody can benefit.
I assume that, you've been around extensively. We've seen mega projects, you've seen small projects, you've visited countries that are pretty much at the forefront of what technology has to offer, and vice versa. Could you probably update us here, enlighten us, what markets or areas or regions of the world that you think are doing it, if not completely right, at least better than other regions?
Yes. One of the fascinating things I've found over the years with that opportunity to visit many countries, many people within industry around the world, was to see how there tends to be a regional identity almost in the adoption of technologies. What is it that is driving that group in that area? So that, for instance, when you look at where I am at the moment in Australia, the Australia-New Zealand region, ANZ, has tended to be driven predominantly by the design side of things, in particular architecture. When you look at North America, it has tended to be driven predominantly by the contractors, the construction side of things. In Europe, you would suggest that one of the strong drivers in technology adoption is structural engineering. And when you look at Asia, Asia has been driven as much as anything by facilities management, by operation of their asset base. And so there are very clear...
They couldn't be different.
Exactly. And it's fascinating, even then within regions. For instance, I say that in Asia, it's driven predominantly by facilities management. However, in China, the term facilities management and that job doesn't exist. They have a concept of, and there's work going on to try and change that at the moment, but they have a concept called property management, which really means fence to front door. But there's no education systems in place to teach people about managing buildings and maintaining them. So all sorts of interesting little caveats in each area. Take North America as an example, where I suggested the contractors. A large part of that is because of economies of scale within the much smaller scale of our industry overall. In that, in the United States in particular, contractors can afford to take a design they've received from a design team and rebuild it using BIM technologies to give them the answers they need in construction logistics and other quantities analysis and estimation, et cetera. And so a lot of things happened there, and that drove a lot of development on, in particular, the quantities estimating side of things, which went further to then drive a lot of automation and robotics development. So a lot of development of drone technologies for remote measurement, having a drone fly over a site, scan a pile of sand on the building site and automatically generate a list that says we currently have 130 tons. Yesterday there was 136, the day before was X, so therefore it's dropping at this rate. We'll need to get more sand ordered in 10 days. So a lot of that sort of development and the startups that feed that kind of work were generated by the contractors' needs to track those things. So each region does have its own specific drivers. Now, as we have become more distributed, in particular when you look at what's happened obviously over the last 3 years with the pandemic, we've seen a much more rapid drive for how we deal with distributed teams. And so the collaboration tools have seen an enormous positive change during that time, driven by a factor which is, of course, entirely outside of our industry. While you wouldn't want to suggest that a pandemic is great because it causes us to find new ways to work, what we do have to do a better job of is seeing how other industries have adopted and affected change and utilized change in new technologies, and how we can apply those lessons in our industry more effectively. Again, one of my typical little analogies is if you're running naked through a forest and you sleep wherever you fall over, then you are not touched by the built environment. It has no impact on you. But if you weave a couple of big banana leaves together to keep the rain off your head while you're sleeping on that forest floor, then you have modified your environment, and the built environment affects you. As a result, the built environment affects basically every single human being on this planet. Now, if we go back to those reports from 2004 and the sorts of calculations of wastage that we see in our industry, what would happen if we could affect a 1% change? We use half of the world's energy supply.
The built environment uses half of the world's energy supply.
Yeah, 52%.
Wow.
If we could be 1% more productive, how many coal-fired power plants is that?
How efficient are we with that supply of energy?
Yeah, very inefficient.
Very inefficient.
Very inefficient. Yeah.
So 1%.
How many coal-fired power plants? Yeah.
Yep.
A fascinating exercise, again, that came out of what happened in 2020 was there was a series of satellite images taken of Beijing in April and May of 2020 as the factories in and around Beijing shut down. And it showed essentially the pollution just disappearing, just completely dissipating over the space of 2 months. You get reports of people in northern India saying, "Look, there's Everest. I haven't seen Everest in 50 years.
Wow.
There it is on the horizon.
You know what's a good comparison here would be 1% increase in efficiency in the building environment versus all the EV cars that you need to sell to match
to achieve the same.
To achieve the same.
Absolutely. And you look at the thing with those images of Beijing then is, as the factories came back online late in 21, how quickly all that pollution reappeared. And the opportunity that could have represented to make them more efficient, to make them cleaner. The suggestion of what it might mean if we could shut them down, because as an industry, we are more efficient. Then you look at these technologies we're talking about and the promises that they offer in terms of potentials for productivity improvement of 20, 30%. At least across the design process, across a project overall, 10% plus. You look at the BIM mandate in the UK, BIM level 1, level 2, level 3, etc. They're looking for 20% improvements in the way we operate as an industry. Other industries have achieved way more than that. So if it's reasonable to think that the technologies we have access to have the potential to affect change to that sort of degree, surely looking for a 1% improvement is not an unreasonable goal. And if we can see the needle move, even in a 1% terms, if we can show that we can make that needle move, then we can accelerate that change. Once you crack the door open, I was about human nature earlier. Once you crack the door open to change, demonstrate to someone the value of this little change here, well, then the door's open. And you can start to shove it a little bit wider and wider and wider, and you can accelerate that process.
What's the government's doing? Regulatory bodies, public sector. I mean, this is tremendous. This has a huge impact on everything. I mean, we see governments rushing into these conferences talking about different acts and pacts and all that stuff. And then supposedly they all pretty much lead to a more cleaner environment, controls the emissions and control the change that we're having in the environment. But then you come back and you hear to experts like you that, these are not kind of materializing. They're not translating to initiatives that actually serve the purpose that these governments go to conferences and sign these pacts around. So are you seeing, do you think this could happen, change could happen without the major involvement of these governments and pretty much cascading down all these agreements that they sign or commitments that they make all the way down to the smallest company here and there?
It's interesting to watch the interplay of communities that have been largely government regulation driven versus that have been self-driven, and what that means in the level and quality of adoption of these processes and technologies. When you look at really good examples of government push, the first one for me immediately is Scandinavia, which has done, the countries throughout Scandinavia and the Baltics generally have done a superb job of putting in place the regulatory frameworks and access to resources as well as requirements to accelerate adoption. Then you've got programs like the BIM levels required as part of the UK adoption. In Australia, as an example, we have had a bit of a roller coaster in terms of government requirements. Didn't get involved, then it tended to happen through individual state-based government organizations, then that faded out. Now there's talk at a government level as well. But one of the things that you can see is a difference between a government mandated process and an individually implemented process, in that when these technologies, tools are adopted by individuals, organizations, a community as a whole, it tends to be because that individual or group has recognized the value that this can provide to them, and therefore they have incentive to use it as effectively as possible, to push it as far as it can so that they get the greatest benefit. And so the quality of the adoption, the level of the adoption is very high and very effective. And that's something we've seen in ANZ. On the other hand, unless it's really done well, when a process is required by government, you will get the same innovators pushing and succeeding, but as a general industry, you get a lowest common denominator circumstance that begins to develop. What do I have to do to satisfy the government requirements without interrupting what I actually want to be doing? So what's the bare minimum? How little do I have to invest mentally to achieve that, and I can go on? And so in some circumstances, it's almost become an impediment to really good quality adoption because of that process. And it doesn't have to be. And as I said, Scandinavia is an example of where it's really been done very well, and it's been very effective. Examples there are starting to now be published over the last few years, where they've got major infrastructure projects, a dam, for instance, a hydroelectric facility, built without printed paper. Everything was done electronically. Extraordinary stuff. On the flip side, though, you look at some projects in the Middle East where a government implemented a new BIM requirement in 2018, which required the implementation of BIM on all projects over a certain value. Fabulous. Okay, we do need to have this kind of push. However, when you read through the documents, the process required your project to be certified as compliant with these regulations, as having used BIM, as having picked up certain technologies and processes. How did you certify? Well, you write a letter to the government that says, my project did this, and you put your name on the end of it. And that was literally it. In other words, it actually had really no value at all within that process. And so I think that the government mandates are an important step. We do need to see them. We need to take examples like what we've seen in Scandinavia and implement that. But we also need to ensure that the people that are advising these governments on what is needed and how it can happen need to be people who genuinely understand what is going on, not just old Joe down in booth 13 on the 22nd floor. Well, we'll get him to do it because he's quiet at the moment.
Yeah.
And if we can get the people who do these things in the real world to work with the governments to produce that kind of process, I think we can see some great things happen.
Is that where DBI usually play the best? Do you advise governments? Do you play the glue between?
Yes. Yeah, we are beginning to. It certainly is in the longer term one of the areas in which I believe that DBI will be able to offer substantive help to industry, to global economy in general. We began really simply as a conferencing organization and grew from there. And we are in the process of beginning to implement some of those sorts of changes where we can properly leverage the quality of the community that's involved. I mean, the community that's in DBI that attends the built conferences are the people who truly understand these things, who are truly invested in the way that these processes are carried out, and therefore are the people that we need to see talking to governments. Obviously, writing the books and things, they're already the people doing that, but pushing, leveraging those people to get the information outside of the bubble of this existing community. And we have an extraordinarily expert and passionate and engaged community. And we need now to leverage that to affect this change.
A few years ago, almost a decade ago, the word smart city became as a buzzword, at least in the technology world, right?
Yes.
What's a smart city and how they operate and how they kind of increase the convenience of how people live in that city, the access to different services required, and so on and so forth. And then it kind of died off a few years later. There has been some examples. I think Barcelona is one of them in Spain. I'm not sure how far they went, but there was a specific area there that they adopted a full smart city with the help of some of the largest IT vendors in the globe. There has been many other projects that were spoken of. I don't know if that was for kind of PR and exposure purposes, or if they actually did end up seeing the light. What's your take on smart cities in general, global take on smart cities as an initiative, and how far have we pressed down that route?
Yeah, so I think smart cities development is an absolutely critical part of our path forward. And the other great cliched term now that is in fact important, of course, is digital twins. And both of those things tie to the same question: being able to gather data about the operation of our city and understand it in a way that allows us to more effectively operate those cities. And that, of course, is a extremely important goal. While the terminology might have, smart cities might have faded a little bit or might be replaced by a new term, the basic goal remains and is extremely important. And we are continuing to see a lot of innovation and growth in those areas. And you've got major players that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, like Siemens, that's doing enormous work through the Internet of Things, smart sensors, big data management to help with that. So, for instance, again in Sydney, there are now sensors on a lot of the steelwork underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge that monitor on a constant basis the deformation within the steelwork. And if it exceeds certain basis, it will flag that and bring up a model that shows to the management team, this is an area in the bridge that's moving more than it's expected at this point in its operational life. Go have a look. We're seeing sensors getting mixed into cement mixes, so that when that hydroelectric dam in Norway is poured, the concrete in the dam has sensors in it. And those sensors can be used to monitor, both during the construction, the heat and curing time and curing strength of the concrete, but then again, any movement, over the next several decades in that concrete. Things going into railway infrastructure to monitor, if you're talking about, steel wheel on steel rail, in other words, old style heavy rail systems, measuring the train tracks themselves, because there's a surprising amount of deformation in that steel in very hot conditions. And that then leads to a need for trains to slow down. If we can better monitor what condition that steel is actually in, it improves the entire global distribution network, the supply chain. So major impacts that all of these things have on the way we operate. Another big development that I think is critical in smart cities is a move from massive singular supply In a city, you have one power plant, you have one sewage plant, one water treatment facility, to a micro system. Well, we have 12 of them. Then we can better shift actual supply around within that city as it's needed. We can turn pieces of that network on or off at times so that we're not wasting power. There is a program going on in Australia at the moment that's just run into some trouble with its management team, but hopefully will get resolved and continue forward, to leverage Australia's solar energy production capabilities to provide power internationally. So a 4,200 kilometer long power line connecting Northern Australia with Singapore, and using solar power facilities in Northern Australia to produce over 15% of Singapore's energy requirements. If we can generate power in places that are off peak, and transmit them, provide them to places that are currently in peak need, we can much better utilize our energy development resources, which again, like I talked about for our industry itself, our energy network on a global basis has had to be built on a peak capacity model. It has to be capable of handling peak capacity. But of course, the vast majority of the time, we're not operating at peak capacity, which means all of those resources we've built are being wasted. And because we're talking that single massive supply, you can't just turn off a power plant and turn it back on when you need it. It takes a couple of days to turn off, and it takes a week or more to turn back on, which means they have to be running even when they're not in use.
Correct.
And if you had a dozen of them dozen smaller ones servicing a city, you can turn the individuals off. If you have the ability to take the underutilized supply from one of them and send it somewhere else, which is currently at peak, you can be so much more efficient. So all of these are some of the factors in smart cities development. Transport, where the last mile is the conundrum generally, not how you move people around a city, but how you get them out of their house into the transport network, how you get them off the transport network to their desk. The last mile is a big question there, which autonomous vehicle systems may be able to answer. But even efficiency in transport networks. Is there a way that we can better understand the needs within a particular bus route? There is nobody at this particular bus stop. Therefore, we don't need to stop there.
Exactly.
Or simple things like that. Kinetic energy systems, building piezoelectrics into roadways to use the vibration, the motion of the road surface to generate energy that charges electric buses. So the movement of the buses along the road when they're doing their routes is actually generating the electricity necessary to charge the buses to allow the buses to do their routes. And you start to get a circular energy supply.
Very interesting examples. They truly sound futuristic, and I generally hope we get to a point where we start adopting these on a mass scale.
Yes.
Now, out of the 4 sub-industries that we have here, whether it's the architecture, the engineering, construction, or operation, facility operation, which one of them do you think are adopting these new digital transformative technologies in conducting their day-to-day operations and running their business? Is there a sub-industry that is running with new technologies
at this
more than
stage,
the other?
I would be inclined to say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, at this stage, I'd be inclined to say that the greatest adoption in terms of breadth across their operating requirements is in the design stage. That is at least in part because in the design processes, it is more insular in terms of what is required to adopt these new technologies and methodologies. So I think that we've seen quite good adoption broadly in the design stage BIM tools generally started first and foremost as architectural tools and grew from there. I think the place that we will see the greatest leverage of value, of quality, is in the construction stage, and then indeed in facilities management. Because as an architect, I always think, oh, design, it's the critical part, but it's the smallest part of it. You're talking, $1 million and 2 years. And then in construction, you're talking $50 million and 5 years. But then in operation, you're talking $500 million
Wow.
and 100 years. So we need to properly leverage the design process to make sure that as we design and build, we're building things that during their operation will be the most efficient and effective as possible, because that is the stage in the life cycle of a project where the greatest cost and therefore the greatest potential outcome actually lies. So if we can spend the time at the front end to ensure that the back end is best utilizing all of these changes and all of the technologies, for instance, in smart cities and digital twins, then we can gain massive, massive improvements. Instead of spending 1 year in design, spend 1.5 years. Oh, it slows down the whole project by 6 months. Instead of spending 1 million, spend 2 million. We just threw an extra million at it. But if that saves you 1 year in construction and $1 million, and during the life cycle of the project, it saves you $50 million, that's an awfully worthwhile expenditure.
Absolutely.
And these tools give us the ability to see how that sort of change and how that investment really does drive value addition in those outcomes.
Very aspiring, Mr. Ben. How big is DBI today, and what are your main objectives for 2023?
Okay, so DBI as an organization internally is about 70 people. That's in our administrative team, which is very small, and the committees that help us drive events and activities on regional bases. Most of that is in fact volunteers, and we are a volunteer-centric organization because it's critical to us that the people that do drive, for instance, the design and content of our events are active industry participants, so they truly know what industry needs. Part of what that also means is those people are spread across 18 time zones, which can be a little bit painful at times, but it ensures that we get the broad input of all of the regional differences, all of the differences in methodologies and output and energy, passion that's required to drive it. Then we have a community of about 12,000 people that are involved more generally, that are attending events or getting involved in some of the conversations we have. For 2023, in simplest terms, it is, of course, a recovery year. We need to spend the time getting back on our feet in terms of running events, in terms of connecting communities. For me personally, I've spent the second half of 2022 and probably most of 2023 on the road full time because of wanting to just get conversations going again and reconnecting communities around the world, saying, time to get talking again, time to get back to face, to see each other, to leverage those random conversations in hallways that turn into new companies and new tools and things of that nature. So that's the simplest part of 2023. And then from there, we want to increase and build the actual community, the community tools and resources side of the community that we've built. And we have programs that we want to implement into the future, such as Built by Built, which is about creating physical structures, a physical legacy in the various places we visit that can be used to demonstrate new technologies, processes, methodologies, and that can be left behind as a contribution to local needs, local weaknesses in social structures and things of that nature. We want to do more work, as you already quite rightly noted, in relation to working with governments. We have a scholarship program that we're looking to accelerate and a mentorship program. The Built Academy, which is our tertiary education focused processes. We want to expand that, and indeed to start outreach with that group into the secondary education, putting in front of people in high school, particularly young girls in school, the advantages and opportunities to join this industry. We are a volunteer-centric organization because it's critical to us that the people that do drive, for instance, the design and content of our events are active industry participants, so they truly know what industry needs. Part of what that also means is those people are spread across 18 time zones, which can be a little bit painful at times, but it ensures that we get the broad input of all of the regional differences, all of the differences in methodologies and output and energy, passion that's required to drive it. Then we have a community of about 12,000 people that are involved more generally, that are attending events or getting involved in some of the conversations we have. For 2023, in simplest terms, it is, of course, a recovery year. We need to spend the time getting back on our feet in terms of running events, in terms of connecting communities. For me personally, I've spent the second half of 2022 and probably most of 2023 on the road full time because of wanting to just get conversations going again and reconnecting communities around the world, saying, time to get talking again, time to get back to face, to see each other, to leverage those random conversations in hallways that turn into new companies and new tools and things of that nature. So that's the simplest part of 2023. And then from there, we want to increase and build the actual community, the community tools and resources side of the community that we've built. And we have programs that we want to implement into the future, such as Built by Built, which is about creating physical structures, a physical legacy in the various places we visit that can be used to demonstrate new technologies, processes, methodologies, and that can be left behind as a contribution to local needs, local weaknesses in social structures and things of that nature. We want to do more work, as you already quite rightly noted, in relation to working with governments. We have a scholarship program that we're looking to accelerate and a mentorship program. The Built Academy, which is our tertiary education focused processes. We want to expand that, and indeed to start outreach with that group into the secondary education, putting in front of people in high school, particularly young girls in school, the advantages and opportunities to join this industry. Because if we're doing that at university level, well, it's too late. People have already made their decisions and are working towards it. So at that level, we can help to provide resources and connections to industry, but we can't, it's already past the point of saying, yes, you can do this. This is possible. So we want to get into high school to touch on a lot of those things as well and start to broaden the net of people that might join this industry. And then beyond that, there's other programs around how we foster and work with startups and encourage those sorts of programs. We've run a number of hackathons over the years. We'd like to see more of that happening. In December of this year, we'll be having an event in Washington, D.C., and it's primary theme, its focus is on rebuilding in the truly major way, focused on Ukraine. When you look at what's happened there, obviously, with the war and the devastation of infrastructure and what's going to be required to rebuild that, the money, the time, the resources needed is mind-boggling. And the implementation of these things that we've just been talking about, new technologies and processes, can multiply the value in terms of the speed to rebuild. And we're talking roads and water and power and hospitals. I mean, elements that, if they take longer to build, actually directly influence death post-war because of lack of access to resources.
Correct.
And all the things that
Correct.
we do as a group can affect that. So getting together with the industry to say, let's think about what's happening in the Ukraine and how we can apply the stuff that we do to take what is a 30-year, $2.3 trillion process and turn it into a 20-year, $1.5 trillion process. And how many lives will that save? So we're trying to do a lot of those things, trying to connect the industry to the people that need to hear from them.
Well, you definitely have a very busy year ahead. And
Yes.
An interesting one. An interesting. We can't wait to attend your future events, especially if you're around here in the United States. It's been a pleasure talking to you. If you're accepting,
Likewise.
If you're accepting any applications for volunteers, please count us in. Make sure.
Thank you very much. And we are
well.
always looking for people, yes, to help us. Absolutely.
Very interesting talking to you. Thank you again for taking the time talking to us today.
Likewise, lovely to see you.
I mean, we truly appreciate and love everything you guys are doing. If anything, we think you should probably be doing 10 times what you're doing right now. We hope that you get the resources needed to be able to do 10-fold, 20-fold, 100-fold what you're doing right now. This is exactly what we need to be focusing on as a planet and as a human race. And we hope that we talk again in the future and get to see you one day.
Indeed. I look forward to that very much.